Japan and Germany seemed like natural enemies during World War II. Both nations were fiercely nationalistic and thought other races were inferior to them. So how did they become allies? It's natural to wonder how two hyper-nationalistic countries who at the time weren't great at getting along with others became allies. But while it was mutual interest with the Axis powers that brought Japan into the war alongside Germany, there was certainly more than sheer pragmatism involved. The real answer lies in a shared history of cultural exchange dating all the way back to the 19th century. So before we get to the gunfire and the bombs of World War II, before Hitler and Hirohito even came to power, we first need to return to the age of the samurai. By the year 1861, the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan's military dictatorship, was rapidly approaching its end. Contact with foreign industrialized powers such as the United States of America had made the Japanese population suspicious of outsiders. A treaty known as the Convention of Kanagawa had been signed with the U.S., bringing an end to more than 2 centuries of Japanese isolationism by opening up the Japanese harbors to American ships. The signage happened in 1854 under the threat of naval warfare, a practice known as gunboat diplomacy. This arrival of the black ships, or Kurofune Raiko in Japanese, left the people shaken for decades to come. Anti-foreigner activists and many patriotic samurai called for a more aggressive foreign policy in repelling these Western intruders. As the shogun's claim to power was based partially on the appearance of military superiority, the idea that the government had submitted to the terms of a non-Japanese force was seen as an insult by much of Japan's population. There was a growing divide between the shogun and the emperor, with the governance of the former being viewed as corrupt and incompetent, and the latter being seen as more deserving of his position. Amidst this mounting pressure, ambassadors from Prussia, as Germany was known before the founding of the German Empire, established a friendly cultural exchange with Japan. While the threat of American imperialism loomed large over Japan's foreign policy, the Prussians were allowed in on much friendlier terms. Even during its long period of isolation, the Japanese government had allowed limited trade from the Dutch, and perhaps the similarities between the Dutch and German languages played a role in making these early German visitors more welcome. Nonetheless, the treaty signed between Japan and Prussia was just as unequal in terms of military power. And while nominally a gesture of good faith, the country giving in to another European nation added to the domestic dissatisfaction with the shogunate. On top of that, the brief but decisive naval conflict with the British in the Anglo-Satsuma War, as well as the Shimonoseki campaign, all but proved the overwhelming power of the Western world. It was clear that if Japan was to expel the barbarians, a common slogan at the time against reliance on the West, it would need to modernize fast. In 1867, Emperor Meiji succeeded to the throne, and with the support of nobility defeated the Tokugawa shogun Yoshinobu in a series of civil skirmishes. Thus began the Meiji Restoration, a period of modernization that would propel Japan toward equal footing with the rest of the world. During this time, the treaties with Prussia were renegotiated and ultimately wound up becoming more favorable to the Meiji-era Japan. The Japanese Empire benefited from the groundwork laid by the Tokugawa shogunate, most notably a diplomatic expedition to Prussia in 1863, where the ambassadors were received with a lavish ceremony by the Germans. A diplomat by the name of Max von Brandt became the representative and minister-resident for Prussia-Japanese relationships, a position he would retain even into the Second Reich, or German Empire. From the start of the Meiji Restoration, many of the most educated Germans immigrated to Japan and were hired by the government in various advisory roles. These Oyatoi Gaikokujin, or hired foreigners, came from a variety of backgrounds but were all brought into the country with the express purpose of helping with the modernization effort. More than any other European model, the Japanese drew on Prussian and later German ideas for reforms to economic and civil society. While the development of stronger military organizations took priority during the encroaching presence of American and European threats, the fields of medicine and law were served greatly by the influence of German scholars. Of particular note was Prussian General K.W. Jacob Meckel, who was directly appointed by the Japanese government as a teacher in the newly founded Army War College. Meckel's influence was instrumental in the modernization of the Japanese Imperial Army, and he was so admired that a bronze statue was constructed in his honor following his death. Prusso-Germanic tactics and organization were the foundation upon which Japan would grow its military might as the Meiji period came into its own. Around the same time that Japan became determined to modernize, the decisive conclusion of the Franco-Prussian War in Europe led to the unification of the German states of the country into Germany. Under the leader of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, The newly minted empire began to engage in colonial projects on a global scale. Germany's newfound focus on industrialization and military expansion would bring it into technological competition with the British Empire, eventually surpassing the world superpower in the naval arms race by the start of the 20th century. The relationship between Germany and Japan likewise continued this way for several decades, with both nations succeeding independently and Japan learning all it could from hired German advisors. The Meiji era saw the rise in Japanese militarism, which became a core part of the developing empire. This was due in part to the fact that many seats of power in the imperial government were held by former samurai. The age where swords were still a viable weapon of warfare had passed, but the desire to prove military superiority and keep the outside powers at bay was still active in the hearts of these noble warriors and officers. The Meiji government was ready to accept any proven tactic or weapon that would bring about Japanese victory on a world stage. German thinkers such as the aforementioned Meckel contributed countless innovations that revolutionized the Japanese army. Universal conscription, the usage of railways to connect key military sites, as well as the structure of divisions to streamline the chain of command. What is so remarkable about the simultaneous economic growth occurring within Germany and Japan is that even while the amicable relationship between the two nations ebbed and flowed, both were burgeoning empires that occupied a similar place in ongoing geopolitics. These were highly nationalistic, highly ambitious states with a mind toward establishing military superiority in their respective regions. Japan did so with its military conquest of parts of China and Russia, and Germany did so by entering the same race for overseas colonies as Britain and France. While both empires operated largely independent from one another, due in part to the massive distance between their territories, the staunch imperialism shared by Germany and Japan gave the governments a very similar outlook on the rest of the world. In a sense, the fact that these countries were the farthest thing from regional neighbors meant that even the most rampant expansionism rarely resulted in competing interests. The two were by all accounts horrendous neighbors, but got along swimmingly as long-distance pen pals. However, there came a time at the end of the 19th century when Germany and Japan had to assert themselves as globally relevant, and that's when their power plays did begin to step on each other's toes. Europe as a whole was beginning to become more invested in conquering Eastern Asia, and Germany was no exception. Likewise, Japan was gaining territory in both China and Russia. Japan's rise to power was starting to become concerning to Germany, as it seemed the once isolated and technologically undeveloped island nation had learned so much about military conquest in such a short amount of time that it threatened to surpass Germany's own fighting strength. This did not stop Germany from sending several of its officers to train and study under the Japanese army. Despite the geopolitical gulf between these two countries growing smaller, or perhaps because of it, the development of combat strategy between the two nations continued as it had before, albeit with a bit more paranoia involved. The year 1914 saw the start of World War I, which both Germany and Japan participated in, but not as allies. For the first time since diplomatic ties were established in 1861, the German Empire and the Japanese Empire saw each other as enemies. Enemies in the biggest war that the world had ever seen, no less. Gone were the days of amicable cultural exchange that began in the time of Prussia and the Tokugawa shogunate. That level of trust between nations would not return to the same level for some time. Fighting on the side of the Entente powers, and especially working alongside the British Navy, Japan played an ongoing role in securing territories throughout East Asia. Germany's territories in the Far East and throughout the Pacific Ocean were seized and occupied by Japanese forces. The war in Europe left the German Empire spread too thin to spare troops to its would-be colonies, and as a result, the Japanese army was met with very little resistance as it continued to steal possessions from Germany abroad. While some of the German colonial officers attempted to fight off the Japanese with their limited resources, there was simply no contest against the shocking might of the Japanese Navy, which made history by introducing the concept of air raids launched from the back of a seaplane carrier to oceanic warfare. By the time the first year of World War I had ended, the German colonies had completely surrendered. For a time, the war brought great prosperity to Japan, allowing its industry and trade to experience global success. The British Empire in particular had come to realize that it could call upon the Japanese army to keep peace in Asia, as it had done in February of 1915 through its naval intervention in Singapore to crush a rebellion of Indian troops. Japan was also given jurisdiction over much of the territory it had taken from Germany during World War I through legal pacts such as the South Seas Mandate. It seemed that as Japan's star was rising, Germany was facing a bitter fall from grace. Economically, the First World War had devastated Germany, directly leading to the unfortunate rise of fascism through Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. What is less talked about is the string of adverse circumstances that resulted in Japan following a similar path toward an economic bust and enmity toward the rest of the world. Japan may have earned the attention of Europe during World War I, but the small island nation would quickly discover that this was not the same as respect. While the British did praise Japan's navy for its speed and efficiency, there was a dissonance in the eyes of the Japanese government between the amount of work the nation had done for the Allied cause and the reward it received in return. Though it might seem appropriate to dismiss Japan's desire for greater territorial acquisitions as further expansionist posturing, there is a great deal of evidence to suggest that the empire was not receiving equal treatment due to discrimination. Europe was more than willing to use the Japanese military to accomplish regional goals in Asia, but there was only so far that their acceptance would extend. The United States of America, for its part, was also clamoring for control of the Pacific, and this resulted in tensions that were beginning to bubble over. The watershed moment that set Japan against the Western world was the rejection of Japan's proposal of racial equality, which, if accepted, would have been part of the Treaty of Versailles and protected under international law. While there's some debate about the content of this proposal, its main goal seemed to be a mandate for equal treatment of immigrants. In Japan's case, those who left the country to pursue work in the United States or elsewhere. Racial equality was not universally shut down, as several European countries such as France and Italy supported it. The British, who had benefited the most from Japan's military assistance, were against it, and with the support of President Woodrow Wilson, found a way to shoot down the proposal while expediting the formation of the League of Nations. On top of losing this landmark proposal, Japan saw the financial boom of the war fall away as it became reliant on other nations' trade for its economy to function. All of the most pressing social fears of both the Tokugawa shogunate and the early Meiji period had come home to roost in Japan. And while it had secured some influence over the global market, there was a long way to go before the nation felt as though it had gotten its dues. This attitude would be the catalyst for an even greater wave of Japanese militarism that would develop throughout the 1920s and 30s. In 1931, Japan would officially be ousted from the League of Nations due to its possession of Manchuria as a puppet state. As different as their goals during the war had been, both Germany and Japan found themselves occupying the same geopolitical niche in the post-Great War world, as both countries had for much of their shared history. Both Germany and Japan struggled after World War I in different ways, and for many years the diplomatic relations between the two nations had all but ceased. That was until the establishment of several cross-cultural organizations in the mid-20s, including the German-Japanese Society and the Japanese-German Cultural Society. Germany was apparently able to put aside the bitterness of losing territory during the war and seek friendly relations with Japan. These efforts were not in vain, as Japan accepted the chance to be on better terms with its former ally. This also began a trend toward Japanese university students going to Germany on foreign exchange. While France was the second most attractive destination for Japanese students studying abroad, the number of students going to Germany dwarfed those going to France, with roughly 80% choosing Germany overall. But as the Second World War approached, the relationship between the two nations would once again become complicated. In 1925, Hitler's manifesto Mein Kampf was released, and in it the soon-to-be dictator laid out his potential plans of allying with Japan in order to achieve victory over his international enemies. Even more so than Great Britain, Hitler and his followers saw Japan as an opportune country to gain the support of. However, when the Nazis took power in the Weimar Republic, there was a significant rise in xenophobia and anti-Asian yellow peril propaganda. In 1933, this bigoted sentiment led to a rise in violence occurring on university campuses toward Asian foreign exchange students from both Japan and China. Both countries issued warnings to their own citizens to stay away from Germany, calling it unsafe. As it tends to be with fascist governments, Germany and Japan were not brought together by finding a common good to work toward, but rather common enemies to destroy. Their mutual hatred of the Soviet Union and later Roosevelt's America pushed both countries ever closer to an uneasy but firm strategic alliance. In 1936, the Anti-Comintern Pact was signed into law, solidifying the united German-Japanese cause of eradicating international communism as expressed through Soviet culture. While racism was still endemic to Nazi Germany, the signing of this agreement with Japan persuaded the German High Command to include the Japanese people as honorary Aryans. In 1938, several of the Hitler Jugend or Hitler Youth were allowed to travel overseas to Japan for an extended visit. That same year, construction began on a brand new Japanese embassy in Berlin. The partnership between the two nations seemed stronger than ever. No longer based solely on formal economic growth, but spurred into almost religious importance by the fascist mysticism of the Nazi Party. And while Germany was in the throes of a conspiratorial struggle against an imaginary foe, there were many leaders in Japan who were overall skeptical about Hitler and his plans. One such skeptic was Yosuke Matsuoka, who served as Japan's Minister of Foreign Affairs from July 22, 1940 to July 16, 1941. He's quoted as expressing disagreements with Hitler's politics when addressing a group of Jewish businessmen on December 31, 1940. "I am the man responsible for the alliance with Hitler, but nowhere have I promised that we would carry out his anti-Semitic policies in Japan. This is not simply my personal opinion, it is the opinion of Japan, and I have no compunction about announcing it to the world." Matsuoka was a key player in the formation of the Tripartite Pact, one of the overriding documents that governed the Axis powers. He would live to regret his actions in office, as his final public words on the matter were, "Entering into the Tripartite Pact was the mistake of my life. Even now I still keenly feel it. Even my death won't take away this feeling." While from a modern perspective it might be difficult to imagine how Japan could overlook the obvious danger in Nazi Germany, it makes sense when you consider Japan's historical approach to adopting the customs of other cultures. Since ancient times, Japan appropriated aspects of Chinese culture, including religious beliefs, altering them domestically in much the same way the Romans did with the Greek pantheon. Japan's previous dealings with Prussia show another example of the country's tendency to absorb what it believes are the best parts of other cultures. Even during World War I, Japan learned and then perfected the art of submarine warfare from the British. To define the parts of Germany that seemed most admirable, and to imitate and iterate on those to the best of their ability was already how Japan was used to engaging with international partnerships. And from the outset of World War II, this feeling of admiration became mutual. The war had restarted Japan and Germany down the path of parallel industrialization and expansion, and just like in the days of old, this once again fostered a unique global friendship between the two nations. The geographical distance was an ever-present factor in allowing the partnership to continue, as the annexation of surrounding lands went from skirmishes to full-blown warfare. Japan invaded China, while Germany concerned itself with European enemies and eventually Russia. Both nations operated as independently as they always did, with very little correspondence on the highest chain of command. During World War II, the Germans and Japanese fought two different wars against the same Allied cause, and both surrendered independently. However, as true as that might have been in the end, Japan continued to learn tactics from the German army as it had in the past. In 1940, a Japanese general, Tomoyuki Yamashita, spent time in Berlin in hopes that observing the German Luftwaffe and seeing how they fought would improve Japan's own aerial forces. Yamashita even joined in an air raid personally, participating in the bombing of Great Britain. During his visit, General Yamashita even met with Adolf Hitler himself and found the man to be more than simply a proponent of Japanese imperialism, but a full-on Japanese military fanboy. For such a feared and respected leader, Hitler was often seen to have the mind of a precocious child, and this quote from Yamashita highlights that. "I felt that in the mind of Hitler, there was much of spiritual matters, transcending material plans. When I met the Führer, he said that since boyhood he had been attracted by Japan. He read carefully reports of Japan's victory over Russia when he was only 17 years old, and was impressed by Japan's astonishing strength." Before Yamashita departed from Berlin, Hitler made another promise to the man, stating the German people should bind themselves eternally to the Japanese spirit. Japan would go on to offer a bit of their country's spirit throughout the war, in the form of 3 ceremonial katana blades that were bestowed upon some of the Third Reich's most celebrated commanding officers. These 3 Germans were Erwin Rommel, Hermann Göring, and a lesser-known naval commander by the name of Bernhard Rogge, who captained the Atlantis. The spiritual connection between Germany and Japan was entirely mutual, but the realities of fighting a war on so many fronts made coordination difficult. Germany saw to forestalling Japan's attack on Russia until the Germans gained more ground, despite the German army suffering heavy losses in the conflict. Within Japan, there was also a great deal of hesitation and fear when it came to the prospect of invading the United States. There was never a question of whether or not America was a potential enemy for the Axis, or that the Japanese leadership did not have a contempt for the Star-Spangled Nation. Rather, the anxiety felt by many Japanese leaders was a measured response to their country's military limitations. Ever since the arrival of the Black Ships all that time ago, America had remained out of Japan's reach as a world superpower. The advancements made in Japan throughout the decades that followed, tactically and technologically, had done surprisingly little to shorten the gap in military might between the empire and the USA. When the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor was carried out and Japan officially declared war, Adolf Hitler declared war against America right alongside them. But like most of the gestures made between the two countries in World War II, it was just that, a gesture founded on sentiment as opposed to practical warfare. The fact was that for all the stock that the Japanese and Germans placed in each other, there was no coherent strategy that would ever unite their causes toward a complete victory over the Allies. Given how the nations turned on each other in the past once material conditions presented other opportunities, the Third Reich and the Japanese Empire could very well have come to blows without ever dropping the facade of mutual respect. But that is only speculation. What we do know is that both the Japanese and German people found each other to be kindred spirits throughout history, an indelible cultural bond that exists to this day, thankfully now in far more innocent form. Now watch what countries would look like after World War III, or check out this video instead.